The transaction was recorded on October 12, 1876, in the ledger of the Prairie Rose Township Council. It was a single line of neat, spidery ink, an entry of such minor consequence that it was squeezed between a note on the purchase of new hinges for the meeting hall door and a tally of grain sacks lost to weevils. The entry read, "Sold to Alara Vance, one derelict silo and attached quarter-acre, parcel 7B, for the sum of $2. $2 silver. That was the official value placed upon the husk of blackened stone that stood silhouetted against the vast, unforgiving sky. It had been the anchor of the old Miller farm until a lightning strike and the subsequent fire had consumed the barn, the farmhouse, and Mr. Miller's will to rebuild. The silo, its wooden cap and internal mechanisms incinerated, was all that remained, a scorched, hollow tooth jutting from the plains. To the people of Prairie Rose, it was a monument to failure, a blemish on the landscape to be ignored until the wind and the winters finally tore it down. To Alara Vance, it was the only thing she could afford. She was 19 years old, a widow for 10 months. Her husband, Thomas, had been taken by the lung fever that had scythed through the settlement the previous winter, leaving her with little more than his name, a threadbare quilt, and a profound understanding of how swiftly a poorly built house could betray its occupants to the cold. She had spent that winter listening to the wind pry at the chinking of their rented cabin, feeling the drafts snake across the floor like icy water, feeding their precious cordwood into a stove that gave back only a grudging, temporary warmth. She had watched the life fade from Thomas in a room that was never truly warm, and she had sworn an oath to herself that she would never be that cold again. Her decision to purchase the silo was met not with sympathy, but with a unique brand of communal disbelief that quickly curdled into condescending pity. The town council, a tribunal of 3 self-important men who governed the small settlement, had agreed to the sale primarily for their own amusement. Mr. Elias Abernathy, the council head and a man whose girth was a testament to his prosperity, had looked down his spectacles at her from behind his great oak desk. "Young woman," he had declared, his voice a low rumble of paternalistic authority, "the council grants your peculiar request, but it is our duty to advise you against this folly. That structure is a ruin. It is fit for naught but owls and field mice. You will not survive a week in it, let alone a winter." Beside him, Mr. Gable, the town's only carpenter and a man who believed the answer to every problem could be found in pine boards and iron nails, had nodded sagely. "The stone is compromised by the fire. It's unsound. A good gust of wind, a heavy snow, and the whole thing will come down on your head. You need a proper frame house, Mrs. Vance. 4 square walls and a pitched roof. It's the only sensible way to build." Alara had simply met their gazes, her hands clasped in front of her. Her expression was calm, betraying none of the grief or the quiet desperation that fueled her. "I have the $2, she had stated, her voice even and clear. It was not a plea, but a statement of fact. She slid the 2 heavy silver coins across the polished surface of the desk. The sound they made was definitive. Mr. Abernathy had sighed, a great gust of theatrical exasperation. He picked up the coins as if they were distasteful curiosities and dropped them into a small wooden box. The purchase was made. The folly was hers. As she left the meeting hall, she heard the 3rd councilman, Mr. Finch, who owned the general store and held the town's credit in his fist, chuckle. "She's bought her own tombstone for $2. The laughter that followed them out the door was dry and brittle, like autumn leaves skittering across a frozen road. Alara did not hear them, or if she did, she gave no sign. She was already walking toward her property, her mind not on their mockery, but on the knowledge that had been her grandfather's legacy. He had been a man from the old country, a place of high mountains and deep winters, where people understood the earth not as an enemy to be conquered, but as an ally to be embraced. He had taught her about the great, slow heartbeat of the soil, the concept of thermal mass, the way the ground itself could be a blanket against the most brutal cold and a cellar against the most scorching heat. He had spoken of homes dug into hillsides, of stone walls that drank the winter sun, and of roofs made from the living sod. They were principles as old as the hills themselves, but here, on the flat, windswept prairie where men built their thin wooden boxes in defiance of the elements, they were forgotten wisdom. Or worse, they were heresy. Her work began the very next morning, on October 13th. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of frost and decaying leaves. Her inheritance from Thomas amounted to a few sturdy tools, a shovel with a worn handle, a heavy pickaxe, a wheelbarrow with a wobbly wheel, and a keen-edged axe. Her assets were these tools, her own unyielding strength, and the $27 she had saved from selling the last of her and Thomas's meager possessions. This small fortune, a collection of worn bills and silver coins tied in a kerchief, would have to be enough. The silo's interior was a circle of char-blackened stone, roughly 18 feet in diameter. The floor was a mess of ash, burnt timbers, and the accumulated debris of a year of neglect. Her first task was clearance. For 3 days, from sunup to sundown, she shoveled and hauled, wheelbarrow load after wheelbarrow load of soot and ruin. She piled the charred wood to one side. It was poor fuel, but it would have to do for small fires to heat her meals. When she was finished, she stood on a floor of hard-packed earth, the stone walls rising around her like a great, dark well. Then came the true labor. Her grandfather's teachings were precise. A dwelling of this type needed to be deep enough to borrow the earth's constant temperature. The goal was to get the main living floor below the frost line, which in this part of the country could be more than 4 feet deep. Alara decided to go deeper. She marked a new, smaller circle on the silo floor, this one 16 feet in diameter, leaving a 2-foot ledge around the interior circumference. Then, with the heavy pickaxe, she broke the earth. The work was brutal, a relentless cycle of swinging the pick, shattering the dense soil, and shoveling the loosened dirt into the wheelbarrow. Her hands, soft from a year of domesticity, blistered on the first day, bled on the second, and began to form thick, tough calluses by the end of the week. Her back and shoulders screamed with a fiery, unfamiliar pain. Each evening, she would stumble back to the small room she rented in town, too exhausted to do more than wash the grime from her face and fall into a heavy, dreamless sleep. The townspeople watched her daily procession, a solitary, dirt-smeared figure pushing her wobbly wheelbarrow, and the whispers followed her like a shadow. They called it Alara's pit. She excavated a staggering volume of earth. The interior of the silo became a cavern, descending foot by painful foot. She worked methodically, keeping the walls of the pit straight and true. The soil she removed was not waste. She piled it carefully outside, separating the rich topsoil from the denser clay beneath. This clay, she knew, would become the very walls of her home. By the end of October, the pit was 12 feet deep from the top of the silo wall, with the living floor a full 8 feet below ground level. She had moved, by her own estimation, more than 1,500 cubic feet of earth, all by hand, all alone. Mr. Gable, the carpenter, made a special trip out to her silo at the beginning of November. He stood at the edge of the pit, looking down at her as she worked. He held a plumb bob in his hand, a professional affectation he employed even when just giving his unsolicited opinions. "Mrs. Vance," he called down, his voice echoing slightly in the stone cylinder. "I came out of Christian concern. This is madness. You've dug a well, not a foundation. When the first big rain comes or the spring melt, you'll be flooded. This whole hole will fill with water and mud. You'll drown in your own home." Alara paused, leaning on her shovel handle. She wiped a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of a gritty hand, leaving a streak of mud on her forehead. "The ground here is high, Mr. Gable," she answered, her voice steady and respectful but firm. "And the soil has good drainage. I will also be digging a drainage trench on the north side, filled with gravel, leading to lower ground." Gable scoffed, letting his plumb bob swing. "A trench? A child's sandcastle defense against a prairie storm? And what of the air? It will be damp and foul down there. You'll catch your death of consumption before the frost even sets in. It's a cellar. People store potatoes in cellars. They don't live in them." "The earth maintains a steady temperature, Mr. Gable," she explained patiently as if to a student. "Around 50 to 55 degrees year-round. It will be warmer in here during the winter than in your drafty house, and it will require far less fuel to heat." He laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "Warmer than my house? My house is built of good, solid pine, with horsehair insulation and a proper fieldstone fireplace. Your pit is made of dirt. You cannot argue with the principles of construction, woman. Wood is warm, dirt is cold. It is the way of things." He shook his head, a mask of performed sympathy on his face. "I urge you, for your own safety, abandon this project. I would be willing to arrange a small loan against your future labor to purchase the lumber for a simple cabin, a one-room structure, but a proper one." "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Gable," Alara said, turning back to her work, "but I will see this through." The thud of her shovel biting into the earth was the only further reply she offered. He watched her for another minute, then turned and walked away, shaking his head at the stubborn foolishness of a woman who thought she knew better than a man with a hammer and a saw. With the pit dug, the next phase of construction began. Using the clay she had so carefully saved, she started to create an inner lining for the stone wall. This was a technique her grandfather had called cob, a mixture of clay, sand, water, and straw. She spent a day hauling water from the nearest creek, bucket by bucket. Then she mixed the components with her bare feet, stomping and turning the heavy, thick mud until it reached the perfect consistency. It was messy, exhausting work. She then began applying this mixture to the stone walls, filling every crack and chink, creating a smooth, seamless inner surface from the floor of her pit to the top of the original silo wall. The cob served multiple purposes. It was an excellent insulator. It sealed against drafts, and it would help regulate the humidity within the dwelling. As she worked her way up the walls, she built furniture directly into them. A raised platform for her bed, shelves for storage, a bench near where the stove would be. All were sculpted from the same earthen mixture, emerging organically from the walls. They would be solid, immovable, and part of the structure's thermal mass. She was not just building a shelter, she was creating an organism, a single integrated system designed for one purpose: survival. The most critical part of the design was the roof and the southern face. The original silo was a perfect circle. On the south-facing side, she began the painstaking work of dismantling a section of the stone wall, from the top edge down about 8 feet. She used a heavy sledgehammer and a pry bar, carefully removing the stones and setting them aside. This created a large opening, a maw in the side of the silo. This was where the light and heat would enter. For the roof, she used the last of her money. She paid a farmer from the next county $17 for a dozen heavy 20-foot timbers that had been part of an old bridge. Getting them to the silo was an ordeal that took 4 days, and the help of the farmer's 2 stout sons, whom she paid with the last of her coffee and sugar. With immense effort, using a system of levers and ramps she devised, Alara positioned the timbers to span the top of the silo. They were not laid flat. Instead, they were angled sharply, running from the high, intact northern rim of the silo down to the top of the lowered southern wall. This created a steep, slanted plane, a roof angled at precisely 60 degrees to the horizontal, an angle her grandfather had taught her was optimal for catching the low winter sun at their latitude. Upon this timber frame, she laid down a deck of rough-sawn planks she salvaged from the Miller farm ruins. Over the planks, she layered her waterproofing. She couldn't afford proper tar paper, so she improvised. She spent $4 on several bolts of thick canvas from Mr. Finch's store, which she then painstakingly waterproofed herself, painting them with a mixture of heated pine resin and linseed oil. This sticky, pungent task took 2 full days. She laid the treated canvas over the planks, overlapping each sheet carefully. The final layer was the earth itself. She laid thick squares of sod, grass side down, directly onto the waterproofed canvas. This created a dense, absorbent layer. On top of the sod, she shoveled a 2-foot-thick layer of the topsoil she had excavated weeks before. The roof was now a seamless part of the landscape, a green and brown slope that would insulate, protect, and absorb the sun's warmth. She planted the roof with native prairie grasses, whose roots would eventually create a living, interwoven shield against erosion. To the casual eye, it would soon look as if a small, natural hill had simply slumped against the old stone ruin. The opening on the south face was the dwelling's eye. She framed it with sturdy wood and installed the most expensive and crucial component of her new home. She had found a set of large, discarded windows from a failed hotel in a town 50 miles away and had paid a freight hauler $5 to bring them to her. They were wavy and imperfect, but they were large panes of glass. She set them into the frame, creating a great angled wall of glass that formed the entire southern exposure of her living space. It was a passive solar collector, designed to allow the low winter sun to pour in, striking the dark earthen floor and the thick northern cob wall, which would absorb the heat all day and radiate it back slowly through the long, cold night. In the summer, the high angle of the sun would be blocked by the roof's overhang, keeping the interior cool. It was a simple, elegant principle of thermodynamics, completely foreign to the box builders of Prairie Rose. Mr. Abernathy and Mr. Finch paid her a visit in mid-November, just as she was finishing the glazing. The first snows had already dusted the prairie, and the wind had a sharp, biting edge. They stood with their collars turned up, their hands deep in their pockets, looking at her strange creation. "Good heavens, woman!" Abernathy boomed, his voice full of disbelief as he stared at the wall of glass. What is this contraption? A hothouse for growing tomatoes? You'll freeze solid. That glass will suck every bit of warmth out of the place. It's a window the size of a wall. Have you ever heard of frost on a window pane, Mrs. Vance? That entire wall will be a sheet of ice by December. Finch, a smaller, weasel-faced man, nodded in agreement. He's right. All that glass. It's a terrible expense and a terrible idea. And this mud roof? The first heavy snow will collapse it. The weight will be tremendous. You've built yourself a death trap, plain and simple. Alara was fitting the final pane of glass, carefully applying a putty she had made from clay and oil. She did not turn to look at them. The angle of the glass is intentional, Mr. Abernathy. It faces the sun. It will gather heat, not lose it. And the roof, Mr. Finch, is supported by bridge timbers. It can hold more weight than any roof in this town. Nonsense, Abernathy retorted. You're speaking gibberish. Angles and suns. A house needs small windows to keep the heat in, and a proper shingled roof to shed the snow. These are known facts. You are ignoring generations of proven building knowledge in favor of what? Some pagan dirt worship? Alara finally set her tool down and turned to face them. Her clothes were stained, her face was smudged with dirt, and her hands were the rough, capable hands of a laborer, but her eyes were clear and steady. I am building a home that works with the prairie, not against it. My knowledge is also from my ancestors. It is just from a different place, and perhaps an older time. It is folly, Finch said flatly, and when the winter truly comes, you will regret it. Do not come to us for help when your glass is shattered and your roof is in your lap. We have warned you. They left, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. They were confident in their wisdom, secure in their conventional world. Not one of them had lost a family member to the cold inside a properly built house. Not one had spent a winter rationing firewood piece by piece. And not one, Alara knew, would ever admit they had been wrong. Her final task was the installation of a small, efficient stove. It was a cast-iron model she had bought used for $3, and she placed it near the center of the room. Its genius was in the chimney. Instead of running it straight up through the roof, where most of the heat would escape, she ran the stovepipe horizontally through a long S-shaped channel built into the earthen bench she had sculpted along the north wall. The hot gases from the fire would travel through this massive cob structure, transferring their heat into its thermal mass before finally exiting through a small pipe near the roofline. The bench itself would become a giant, slow-release radiator. It was a system that would extract over 80% of the heat from a handful of fuel. By the first week of December, she was finished. She moved her few belongings from her rented room into the silo. The interior was dark and womb-like, smelling of damp earth, clay, and pine resin. The only light came from the great south-facing window. It was a single, circular room, Spartan but functional. Her bed was a thick mattress of straw and ticking on the raised cob platform. Her shelves held jars of dried beans, salted pork, flour, and coffee. Beneath the floor, she had dug a small root cellar, accessible by a trapdoor, where potatoes and carrots lay in cool, dry sand. Her firewood, scavenged and carefully seasoned, was stacked neatly along one wall. It was not a large pile. It did not need to be. On December 18th, 1876, the sky began to change. It was a subtle shift at first, a paling of the blue to a milky, luminous white that stretched from horizon to horizon. The air grew unnaturally still, and the temperature, which had been hovering around a brisk 20 degrees Fahrenheit, began to plummet. The townspeople of Prairie Rose noted the signs. They had seen winters before. They brought in extra loads of firewood, banked their stoves, and checked the latches on their doors. They felt the familiar, almost comforting sense of hunkering down, of preparing to ride out a storm for a day or two. There was a confidence in their preparations, the same confidence that had built their homes and governed their lives. Alara felt the change in the air, too. She brought her last few tools inside and sealed the heavy, insulated door she had built. She lit a small fire in her stove, using only a few pieces of kindling and one split log. The air inside the silo was a cool, stable 52 degrees. Within an hour, the heat circulating through the cob bench had raised the ambient temperature to a comfortable 65 degrees. She sat on the warm bench, drinking a cup of hot coffee, and watched the outside world through her wall of glass. The snow began not as flakes, but as a fine, granular powder, a horizontal stream driven by a rising wind. By midday, the wind was no longer a moan, it was a shriek. The world outside the glass dissolved into a churning, boiling chaos of white. It was not a snowstorm. It was a blizzard, a white hurricane, as the old-timers called them. The temperature dropped to 10 below zero, then 20, then 30 below. The wind howled at over 60 miles per hour, driving the effective temperature down to a level that could freeze exposed flesh in less than a minute. Inside their wooden houses, the people of Prairie Rose began to feel the first tendrils of fear. The wind found every crack, every seam in the board and batten construction. It forced its way through the window sashes and under doors. The cold was a physical presence, a predator clawing its way inside. Their stoves, which had seemed so robust, now roared day and night, consuming wood at a terrifying rate just to keep the indoor temperature above freezing. The men made desperate, dangerous trips to their wood piles, fighting through waist-deep drifts and blinding snow, only to find the piles shrinking with alarming speed. In Mr. Gable's well-built house, the wind tore shingles from the roof, and fine, stinging snow began to sift down into the attic, then through the ceiling boards. In Mr. Finch's store, the large plate-glass windows facing the street, his pride and joy, became coated with a 2-inch layer of crystalline frost on the inside, and the cold radiated from them like a block of ice. In Mr. Abernathy's large 2-story home, the largest in the settlement, his family huddled together in a single room, wrapped in every blanket they owned, feeding their grand fireplace with furniture because the woodpile was already gone. The storm did not last for a day or two. It raged for 3 days and 3 nights without pause. It was a meteorological anomaly, a perfect storm of Arctic air and moisture that paralyzed the entire region. It buried houses to their eaves, knocked down telegraph lines, and entombed the world in a silent, white prison. The sound of the wind was constant, a deafening, insane roar that frayed the nerves and extinguished all hope. Inside her silo, Alara was warm. The temperature never dropped below 60 degrees. She kept the fire in her stove small and steady, using less wood in 3 days than the Abernathy family had burned in 3 hours. The shrieking of the wind was a muted, distant hum, the sound filtered and tamed by the tons of earth and stone that surrounded her. The snow piled up against her glass wall, but instead of being a threat, it acted as another layer of insulation, a thick, white blanket. Diffuse, pale light still filtered through, filling the space with a calm, serene glow. She ate her meals, read the one book she owned, and slept soundly on her warm earthen bed, protected and secure in the heart of the storm. She was an island of warmth and life in an ocean of lethal cold. She felt a profound, quiet satisfaction, not of pride, but of rightness. The principles had held. The knowledge was true. On the morning of the 4th day, December 22nd, she awoke to silence. The wind had stopped. The sudden absence of its roar was more jarring than the sound itself. She looked at her wall of glass and saw only a solid, glowing wall of white. The snow had buried her completely. She took her shovel and dug her way up and out through a small ventilation shaft she had built for this very purpose. When she emerged, the world was unrecognizable. It was a landscape of pure white, sculpted by the wind into fantastic drifts and dunes. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the sun on the snow was blinding. There was no sign of the town, no roads, no fences, no houses. Only a few dark shapes, the peaks of the steepest roofs, broke the surface of the snow. And from these roofs, there was no smoke. Not a single wisp rose into the crystalline air. A deep, cold dread settled in Alara's stomach. She put on the snowshoes she had made from bent willow and rawhide, and began to walk toward where she knew the town center was. The snow was packed hard by the wind, and in many places, she was walking 15 feet above the actual ground level. It took her nearly an hour to reach the general store, recognizable only by the top foot of its false front, sticking out of a massive drift. She dug at the snow with her shovel, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The temperature was still well below zero. She eventually cleared the top of the main door and was able to pry it open. She dropped down into the frigid darkness of the store. A weak voice called out, "Who's there?" She found them huddled in the back office, their faces gaunt and blue with cold. It was Mr. Abernathy, Mr. Gable, and Mr. Finch, along with their wives and a few other townsfolk. They were wrapped in every scrap of cloth they could find, their bodies shivering uncontrollably. The store's potbelly stove was cold, a black iron corpse in the center of the room. They had burned all the firewood, then all the spare crates, then the counter, and finally, the chairs. Now there was nothing left. They were in the final stages of hypothermia, their minds dull, their bodies shutting down. Mr. Abernathy looked up at her, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He did not seem to recognize the dirt-smeared woman in men's trousers standing before him. "The storm?" he whispered, his teeth chattering too hard for him to speak clearly. It took everything." "The storm is over," Alara said, her voice firm, cutting through their lethargy. "You must get up. You must move. You will die if you stay here." It was Gable who recognized her first. "Mrs. Vance?" he croaked, his voice a dry rasp of disbelief. "You're alive? Your pit? It didn't collapse?" "It is not a pit, Mr. Gable. It is a home," she said, without malice. "And it is warm. There is a fire, and there is soup. If you can walk, you can come with me." It took all of her strength and will to get them moving. They were weak, dazed, and clumsy with cold. She had to half-carry Mr. Finch's wife, a tiny, bird-like woman who was barely conscious. She led the small, stumbling procession of survivors out of the store and across the surreal landscape of snow. They followed her numbly, their minds unable to process what was happening. They were following the woman they had mocked, the fool who had bought a tombstone, and she was their only hope. When they reached the gentle, snow-covered slope that was her roof and descended into the warmth of her home, their reaction was one of pure, animal shock. The transition from the biting, lethal cold to the gentle, radiant warmth was so sudden and so absolute that some of them began to weep. They stared, wide-eyed, at the smooth earthen walls, the glowing south window, the neat, functional space that was warmer and more secure than any place they had ever known. Mr. Abernathy, the great, important council head, sank onto the warm cob bench and pressed his hands against its surface, his face a mask of utter bewilderment. He looked at the small, tidy pile of firewood against the wall, then at the gentle fire in the stove. He looked at the shelves of food, the calm order of the room. He finally looked at Alara, who was ladling hot broth into mugs for them. "How?" he asked, his voice cracking. "How is this possible?" "It is the earth," Alara said simply, handing him a steaming mug. "It holds the warmth. The sun gives its heat for free. The wind cannot take what is buried." Over the next few days, Alara's home became a sanctuary and a hospital. She and the few able-bodied survivors dug out the other houses, one by one. The toll was horrific. Of the 78 souls in Prairie Rose, 42 had perished. They had frozen to death in their own homes, surrounded by all the trappings of what they had considered civilization. They died in their beds, huddled around their cold stoves, their confidence and their conventional wisdom having failed them completely. The survivors, including the 3 councilmen, owed their lives to Alara Vance and her folly. The mockery was gone, replaced by a profound, humbled silence. They saw the truth, not in her words, but in the undeniable reality of the warm, life-sustaining space she had built with her own 2 hands. They saw that her small pile of wood had been more valuable than all of Mr. Abernathy's land, that her knowledge of the earth was superior to all of Mr. Gable's carpentry, and that her $2 investment had yielded a greater return than all of Mr. Finch's carefully counted money. Their vindication was not a moment of triumph for Alara. There was no joy in being right at such a terrible cost. It was a somber, heavy truth that settled over the decimated town. As they buried their dead in the hard, frozen ground, the survivors looked at the young woman who had listened to a different kind of wisdom. She was no longer the town eccentric, the foolish widow. She was the keeper of a knowledge that had been forgotten, a knowledge of resilience, of harmony, and of survival. Her home, the blackened silo, was no longer a blemish on the landscape. It was the heart of a new community, a testament to the simple, profound truth that the strongest walls are not built against the world, but with it. The ledger in the town hall had called it Parcel 7B, but for the rest of its long life, and for generations to come, it would be known only as Vance's Haven,